We're ready to discuss the topic of arrangement. If we can review, there are 5 canons of rhetoric: invention, arrangement, style, memory, delivery. So far we've discussed invention. We're ready to move on to the second of those 5 canons, which is arrangement. It is second in order and, according to the ancients, also second in importance. Invention involves discovering the available arguments. You don't want to use every argument that you discover. And some of the arguments that you discover may seem to be really great arguments, but then when you put them together with everything else, you realize that they're really not that great. And you have to learn to be honest about your arguments as well. You don't want to be such a knucklehead that when you've picked an argument and you think it's brilliant and then you test it on other people and they just scoff at you. What are you thinking? If they're dismissing it offhand, that's a good sign that it's not a great argument. Even though you're smarter than everyone else in the room, you still, and that's part of the process of learning rhetoric. Take your arguments and discuss them with people. Throw it out there. See what their response is. It will help you to see what kinds of objections you might find. And you can't be so arrogant that you're not capable of saying this argument that I thought was great really isn't all that great. Part of arrangement, really there are 2 processes of arrangement. The first one is selecting the arguments to be used. That is a part of arrangement. You've invented them. You came up with 50 arguments, say. You don't want to use all 50. You'll wear your audience out if you do that. And wearing your audience out is not persuasive. So you do have to think about that. So in this sense, arrangement overlaps with invention a little bit. Arrangement overlaps with invention because the first emphasis of arrangement is narrowing down your arguments to a manageable size, but also because you want to use your best arguments. You don't want to waste people's time using trite and trivial arguments that really make your audience think that you don't have anything to say at all. So that's a part. But the reason that the ancients considered arrangement to be second in importance is because after finding the arguments to use, the next thing is for you to arrange those, put them in order, in a persuasive order. And order matters. Orderly presentation, a logical presentation of your case matters. If you can take your arguments and build from this foundational argument and step your audience to your point, to your position, then you've made a powerful case. If you have 4 really profound arguments, you've made your case. It's helpful if you stop and think about something that you've changed your mind on. You've heard arguments on it, and you believed this before, but then you heard this argument, and it changed your mind. The chances are you heard 5 or 6 arguments that prepared you for that one that changed your mind. As a speaker, you don't know which argument it is that will change the minds of your audience. But you need to make a total case. And in order to make that case well, you must arrange it well. John Broadus, in his book on the preparation and delivery of sermons, actually takes, and I know I've said this before in my lectures, he takes the subject of homiletics, of sermon preparation, and ties it in with rhetoric. It really is, part of the reason it's a classic book is because of Broadus's understanding of rhetoric and his ability to translate it to the art of preaching. Broad had this to say about arrangement that I thought was very helpful. In this respect, speaking of arrangement, he said the speaker is an architect. Out of gathered materials, he is to build a structure, and a structure suited to its specific design. The same or nearly the same materials may be made into a dwelling, a jail, a factory, a church. But how different the plan of the building according to its design, and how important that it be built with special reference to the design. In like manner, substantially, the same materials may be wrought into a story, a dialogue, an essay, or a speech. And several speeches on the same subject, embodying much the same thoughts, may make a very different impression according to the plan of each. He went on to say, the speaker's task may be compared to the organization of an army, and then the concentration of its several divisions upon one objective point. I think we've used both those analogies in the past, but it is a great analogy and really one that we'll refer to frequently as we discuss this subject of arrangement. If you think of arrangement, you've got your troops, you've trained your troops, they've gone through basic training, combat training, they're ready to go. You've got all of these different units. Some are foot soldiers, some are armored divisions, you've got artillery divisions, you've got all these different divisions and their specialties, what they bring to the table. And as the general, you've got to put them in the right place on the battlefield so that you make sure that you have the greatest impact on your opponent, on your enemy, so you win the battle. That's the point. Let's don't kid ourselves, and let's don't buy into this modernist assumption that we all ought to be nice and kind and gentle and so on. We're in a war. We're at war. And as Christians, a big part of this warfare is conducted with words. And so you're going to take your arguments and you're going to arrange them so that you put each argument in the spot in your discourse where it can do the greatest damage on your opponents. That's arrangement. I'm sure that the young ladies in the class are not as thrilled about that analogy, but the guys have to be cheering and saying hoorah about right now. This is warfare, and this is how we conduct it. So that being said, I want you to understand also the difference between modern composition and speech courses and the ancient approach to arrangement. Modern courses on rhetoric are divided between speech and English composition. I've talked about that before, but it bears repeating that these modern courses are rhetoric courses. So a speech class is a rhetoric class, but it's like a half rhetoric class. You're not getting the whole thing because you're only thinking about speech. A writing course, English composition, creative writing, any of those kinds of things, again, that's a half rhetoric course. It doesn't consider the whole thing. Here we want to consider the whole thing, and there is a difference, and we need to be clear about that. There's a difference between the way arguments are presented in the spoken word as opposed to the written word. You should be aware of that and the impression that it's making. We'll talk about this more when we talk about ethos, but just keep in mind that in the spoken word, when you're delivering a speech, you're present, and your audience finds it much easier to connect with you. And you have advantages there that are also disadvantages if you're not a likable kind of person. But if you're a congenial kind of person, the kind of person that people want to listen to, it's much easier because your presence is there. In the written word, you have to make your presence felt. and you have to establish a voice that is friendly to your audience, and you have to work harder at that. You have less of a window with written word. People read 3 lines and decide whether they want to continue reading what you've written. Your job is to compel them to keep reading it, to gain their interest and hold it. And that's more difficult in the written word. So, throughout this course, we want to consider the difference between the two. But right now, as we discuss arrangement, I just want to be clear that modern rhetoric courses, speech and composition courses, are really half rhetoric courses, and act as if they're not related at all, but they are related. Modern courses, both speech and composition, approach arrangement the same way, and it's a very formulaic way, arrangement by formula. Usually some variation of introduction, thesis, 3 main points, and the conclusion. You have formulas for business letters, term papers, scientific reports, and so on. There's an expectation, and your teachers tell you to arrange it this way. This is where this goes, this is where this goes, and no consideration is given to the case or the issue that you're speaking on or writing about. No consideration is given to the audience and the various audiences that you might face. No consideration is given even to yourself, who you are, and what your position is in the community, whether you have authority to be speaking about these things or not. That affects your arrangement. So the modern courses are going to give you a formula that you're to follow in every case. Ancient rhetoricians paid a lot more attention to rhetorical situations than to formal rules of arrangement. In other words, the arrangement would be based on the situation. You consider the audience, the issue, and the arguments. Those 3 things. And, of course, you recognize in that the elements of ethos, pathos, and logos as well that are to be considered in a rhetorical situation. So that being said, arrangement deals with the 6 parts of discourse, and that's what we're going to discuss at length in these lectures on arrangement. The 6 parts of discourse are your fundamental arrangement. If I can review what those are, you have your introduction, your statement of facts, your division, your proofs, both positive and negative. So your confirmation, that's the 4th part of division, the 4th part of discourse. And then number 5, your refutation, positive and negative proofs, and then your conclusion. That's your 6th part. Now, if you want some excellent examples of the 6 parts of discourse, just seeing how they work in regular discourse, Spurgeon's sermons are excellent and often textbook examples of this kind of arrangement, and can be studied if you would like to see examples of the classical approach to arrangement. Spurgeon was the Prince of Preachers. He was a master rhetorician, if you will. He was a master preacher. And a part of his mastery was clearly connected to a mastery of the principles of rhetoric. It's interesting in Spurgeon's lectures to my students that he speaks often of the elements and principles of rhetoric, though he does not often speak of them in a positive light. I find that interesting because he was such a master of it and he used it extensively. It was very evident when you understand rhetoric, it's very evident that he was trained in rhetoric. Now, the reason that he would speak against it or speak of it in a negative way would be because in his day it was so Rhetoric was such a flowery thing, and the preachers often relied so much on rhetoric that they were not speaking from the word and speaking from the heart, because they were depending so much on their rhetorical abilities. The story is told of a man who, in the morning on a Sunday, visited the church of Joseph Parker. And Parker was a well-known preacher in his day, probably as well-known as Spurgeon, and a flowery orator. And the man, when he left the service, Joseph Parker's service, after hearing Parker preached, said, he was heard to exclaim, "What a preacher." And then that night he went to hear Spurgeon preach, which, as I understand it, was just across the river, across town in London. And as he left the service, he was heard to exclaim, "What a Savior." Spurgeon, though he was a master preacher, pointed men to Christ. And that's evident in all of his sermons as well when you read his. So Spurgeon gives us a great example of this kind of arrangement, the kind of arrangement recommended by the ancient rhetoricians. Now, we have 6 parts of discourse. Again, introduction, statement of facts or narratio, division or partitio, the proofs, both positive and negative. So the confirmatio and the refutatio, and then the conclusion. Those are the 6 parts of discourse. And the first thing you need to understand is that among the ancient rhetoricians, these 6 parts of discourse were negotiable. Again, they did not have a formulaic approach. So it was not required that all 6 parts be used. Now, in all of your written and oral presentations from this point forward, you will need to use all 6 parts of discourse. But that's because you're in class. And in class, we prescribe it. We want you to learn how to do this. And so you're not experienced enough yet and haven't mastered the subject well enough at this point to decide that you need this or don't need it. So we'll require you to use it all. But I also want you to understand, when you get outside of this class, even now in your history, composition, speech courses, and so on, that these things are negotiable. In fact, there was extensive debate about which parts of discourse, which of these 6 parts were necessary to every piece of discourse, and which were not necessary in every case. People fell on, and ancient rhetoricians fell on all sides of this debate. Some said, no, you don't need 6, you need 12. And there began to be this expansion of the parts of discourse to almost a ridiculous level, where you had your first statement of facts and your second statement of facts and your third statement of facts, and you had your first proofs and your second proofs and your third confirmatio and your fourth refutatio, and so on, and it would get ridiculous. The kind of elaborate arrangements that some looked for. But essentially, the ancient rhetoricians, in their debating this subject of arrangement, came to a consensus of sorts, and their consensus was that 4 parts of discourse were always necessary. Those 4 parts being the introduction, the statement of facts, the proof, which does not always include a confirmatio and a refutatio, a confirmation and refutation, but sometimes just would be proofs. And then fourthly, the conclusion. Aristotle, interestingly, argued that only 2 of the 6 parts of discourse were always necessary. And that was the statement of facts and the proof. You might wonder why the statement of facts. Well, we're going to discuss that later on when we discuss the statement of facts. But essentially, his idea is that it is possible to introduce your subject simply by laying out all the relevant facts in the case, but that you really can't jump into your proofs until you have established what the facts are in the case, because the proofs are built off of the facts in the case. So that was the general idea there. We'll begin then with the exordium, the introduction, the first of the 6 parts of discourse. Douglas and Nate Wilson call it the hook. It's a glimpse of what is to come, the front porch of the talk. So in your discourse, the introduction serves one big purpose, and that is to gain your audience's attention, get them interested in what you're going to talk about. I say one main purpose. Actually, there are a few purposes that all fit. But I think the most important thing that your introduction does is to get your audience willing to listen to you, to hear what you have to say. Exordium in Latin is to urge forward. Quintilian said the sole purpose of the exordium is to prepare our audience in such a way that they will be disposed to lend a ready ear to the rest of our speech. Now, it is important to note that the introduction comes first in the speech, but it should not be prepared first when you're preparing your speech. It should be composed, in fact, after you've composed the statement of facts and your proofs. The idea is basically that you need to know what you're going to say before you introduce what you're going to say. If you don't know what you're going to say, how can you introduce it? It'd be like introducing a perfect stranger to another perfect stranger, someone you've never met before, to someone else that you've never met before. Have you ever tried to do that? This is, what was your name again? Okay, this is Fred. Fred, this is, tell me your name. It doesn't work real well. That's not a very solid introduction. I was invited to speak at one of our county political events, the Lincoln Day Dinner, which is a Republican event every year. And a couple of years ago, I was invited to speak at that. And the man who was to introduce me came up to me beforehand and shook my hand and said, "So you're Dave Melinek?" He said, "I'm supposed to introduce you." He said, "To be honest, I've never heard of you. Who are you? What do you do?" Needless to say, it was not a solid introduction to that august body of Republicans, which included the governor, the lieutenant governor, all of our state and local representatives and legislators and so on. So it was, we got off on a bad leg on that. Nonetheless, you need to make sure you know what you're going to say before you introduce it. That's the point. So though it is the first part of the speech, it should be one of the last things that you actually compose. Cicero recommended that in general the introduction should be dignified and serious. That's interesting too, especially considering how the modern preacher often plies his audience with jokes in our days. Why do you think Cicero recommended that an introduction be dignified and serious? Well, the reason should be fairly obvious to us. The introduction sets the tone for the entire discourse and informs your audience of the seriousness of the matter that you're about to speak of. Much of what we say is said indirectly. Much of what we have to say is said by the way we say it. Do we have respect for what we're about to argue? Do we believe we have a serious case? If so, then why would we start out with something silly? And what are we saying to our audience? What are we communicating to our audience when we start out silly? The introduction should not be vague and disconnected from the issues in the situation. That's another thing. You don't want an introduction that is almost completely unrelated, other than that you're the person who gave the introduction and you're the person making the arguments. You don't want that to be the only connection, you to be the only connection between your introduction and your arguments. You need to make sure there's a connection made between your introduction and your arguments. It can be a subtle connection. It can be something that later on your audience thinks that's why he said that. But ultimately, you want everything you say to be moving your audience towards the points that you're making, so that later when they look back, they'll understand why you started with the things you started with, why you started the way you started. We're going to pause for a moment and come back and continue with our discussion of the introduction, which we have quite a bit to say about that, so we'll be right back.